Good morning. Today I'll be presenting a talk called Partnering with Stakeholders to Develop Actionable, Technically Based Risk Reduction Strategies for Former Uranium Milling Sites. That's quite a mouthful, but I'm going to try and unpack that for you, and hopefully you'll come away with an understanding of what can be done, the kinds of actions that can be done to ensure that your stakeholder communities within tribal groups especially are more relevant within the decision-making process. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Kate Weisner, who's formerly with the Navarro Research and Engineering Company, but she's now with Office of Legacy Management. Anthony Farinacci, who's with the Navarro Research and Engineering, who's our Legacy Management Support Services contractor. Brian Looney, who's with the Savannah River National Laboratory. Joni Talbols with the Navajo Nation Abandoned Mine Lands Program and works with us on our UMTRA sites. And there's also Norman Honey, who's with the Hopi tribe. We'll be talking about how the Hopi tribe is involved in our site at Tuba City. We'll be mentioning that. And so Norman is participating because of he represents the Hopi tribe. We also had the Shiprock, New Mexico tribal government representatives at the chapter level. We're grateful for their participation. And the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, who's our regulator, they're keenly interested, as always, in the amount of participation we have with stakeholder groups, particularly tribal entities. We also have the Navajo Nation Environmental Protection Agency representatives from that group who helped us with this process as well. What I'll be talking about today, and just show it in this outline here, is the Legacy Management Risk Reduction Initiative. And we'll talk briefly about what is stakeholder risk, and then introduced a couple of the Uranium Mill Tailings Radiation Control Act, we call that UMTRCA. UMTRCA sites in Shiprock, New Mexico, and Tuba City, Arizona. Also talk about the National Laboratory Network collaboration process, and then indicate how stakeholder groups and stakeholder concerns are addressed in the work we're doing and how they participate in our laboratory network collaboration. So one of the things that's important to recognize is a lot of sites don't get funding unless they're high on a priority list. And one of the ways that we prioritize funding is by recognizing that each site we have within our portfolio, we have over 100 sites in our portfolio at Legacy Management, and each of those sites to some degree competes for funding against other sites that are within our system. So the way that we rank our sites is based on 4 categories. There's human health risk, regulatory risk, institutional controls risk, and stakeholder risk. Now, there isn't a firewall between each of these categories. There's some drift and intermingling and so forth that exists between those. So you'll hear me talk about institutional control and implementation of institutional controls in the context of talking about stakeholder risk. So, it's not a hard and fast set of categories, but we do use these categories to help us understand what the relative risk is of our sites, and that helps us assign the proper level of funding to each site. The 2 of the highest risk sites in our program are the Shiprock, New Mexico UMTRCA disposal site and the Tuba City, Arizona disposal site. We'll talk a little bit about the reason for that. The Shiprock disposal sites in the northwest corner of New Mexico between the communities of Farmington and Shiprock. Actually, the disposal site is in Shiprock. And that's what drives a lot of the risk. We have a uranium disposal site, uranium tailings disposal site, mill tailings, located in a community, a tribal community. And so we'll talk a little bit about what drives the risk there in that situation. And next, we'll also talk about the Tuba City disposal site. Tuba City disposal site's actually outside the town limits of Tuba City, so it's not the same kind of a risk driver. The elements that drive the risk aren't the same as those that drive the risk at Shiprock. But in a way, stakeholder risk is still a big part of the risk profile for Tuba City, because not only do we have the Navajo Nation who's impacted by this disposal site, but the Hopi tribe as well. So Hopi land is situated as two enclaves within the broader Navajo reservation. And you can see those pictured here in the orange. Those are the Hopi land, and those literally are little enclaves within the Navajo reservation, which is the largest reservation in the United States for Indians, the Navajo tribe. So what is stakeholder risk? We've tried to develop a profile for what this really means. And what it boils down to is that potentially within decision making, there's going to be some controversy. And that controversy could make difficult our decisions that we make around compliance strategies, and sometimes these decisions that we make have a facet to them that involves environmental justice. So if we're working in environmental justice communities such as Shiprock and Tuba City, it's important for us to develop compliance strategies that withstand the controversial aspects of what we may end up doing for decision-making process. So, so to what extent is it possible that we'll erode or degrade DOE's trust relationship within local communities? That's the question in a lot of this. And the higher risk sites are the ones where controversy could certainly play a big role in the success of LM's mission. And so what we work on is cultivating relationship with community groups within the tribal community. So that would include tribal governments, and at the tribal government level within the Navajo reservation, there's such a thing called a chapter. You'll hear about a chapter house, chapter leadership, and in off the reservation places where they're like, in the greater state of Colorado or New Mexico, you've got county government, county commission, and things like that. And those are comparable to what the chapter leadership represents. But the chapter leadership also, though, holds community elders and who also hold a lot of sway and influence within the community. And so tribal members at large are certainly part of the stakeholder community and play a role in our decision-making process as well. So we've got a host of different groups and entities that are involved. It's not just the regulatory community or the national tribal government community that influences our decision-making process. It's also the local community, and that's, I've heard said that all politics is local. And that's kind of an example. So here's a photograph of us, Office of Legacy Management, meeting with one of our constituent groups. It's the Dene Uranium Commission. We had a meeting in Tuba City not long ago where, this is before COVID, and we're able to address a group of concerned citizens who want to learn more about what's going on the uranium issues in general on the Navajo reservation, but because the Tuba City site's located in the area around Tuba City, we this Dene Uranium Commission moves around and meets in different communities on a bi-monthly basis, and semi-monthly basis actually. And what we try and do is whenever they come visit within the area of influence, shall we say, of one of our sites, we want to make sure we're out there, and we usually get an invitation and asked to make a presentation to update folks on what's going on. So the Shiprock community is located in northwestern New Mexico, and today the population in the Shiprock area is over 10,000 residents. And back in the days when uranium was being processed at the site, back between 1954 and 1968, the community was actually north of this area, and the processing site was, for all practical intents and purposes, was in the country. And after uranium milling was completed in 1968, the site was abandoned, and population center just ended up moving over toward the south side of the river, and now there's residential, business, and other interests in very close proximity to our disposal cell. And that, as you might imagine, can cause some friction and some certainly interest on the part of the community as to what's going on there and whether the community is at risk in any way. People want to have answers to those kinds of questions. So we make a big part of our game plan in the interaction with stakeholders to be very open about the risk to human health. We've got listed here grazing restrictions. That's another important thing is Navajos are tied to the land. A lot of grazing happens there. And, is it safe to graze your forage for your forage animals to graze in areas where there might be underlain by contaminated groundwater? Concepts such as those are important because people want to know whether their food is safe. Then there's also groundwater use restrictions. Is it important for us to restrict the use of groundwater? Well, if we've got groundwater contamination that's mill related, the answer is yes, we want to restrict that use. So we do make sure that there are use restrictions in place that could, that will reduce the risk to humans from inadvertent or from exposure to the groundwater. And access restrictions, that's also important. So we've got a fence around our disposal cell, but we're working through this process that we've been working on, we feel that there isn't as much risk out, say, on a floodplain area adjacent to the disposal cell as originally considered. And so even though we had a fence around the access points to our neighboring floodplain, we're thinking now that maybe that's an excessive taking, as it were, of land that doesn't really need to be outside of, restricted access to. So we're looking at that with our local community. At the Tuba City site, we actually have a disposal cell 6 miles outside of Tuba City, and it's also surrounded by open grazing land. But in this case, the actual grazing, the depth of groundwater is sufficiently deep that we don't feel that there's a risk, and we've looked at this pretty closely with forage that's growing out there. Is fairly shallow rooted and doesn't have the ability to penetrate down into areas where the groundwater contamination exists. So we have pretty much free grazing in the area of Tuba City, but the site is also surrounded by a fence to restrict access to places where tailings could be exposed. Say if people start using their four-wheel drives going up and down the side slope of our disposal cell, we don't want that. So we have a fence around our infrastructure there. Excuse me. So just talked about the boundary fence and the grazing restrictions, but one of the other things that's important at the Tuba City site is the spread of contaminated groundwater. And in this particular case, that dashed or stippled area represents what we have show as a nitrate contamination plume in the groundwater. And the yellow area represents where the uranium contamination exists. The nitrate plume's actually moving out in advance of the uranium plume because uranium's bound up more by geochemical processes and doesn't migrate as readily as the nitrate does. And at some point, in a 200 to 400 years maybe, that nitrate plume can potentially reach Moenkopi Wash, which is the discharge point for groundwater in that area. And if that were to happen, and then that nitrate then discharges into the surface water body, and Hopi community is using that surface water body for irrigation for their crops and so forth, you can see how that would result in a concern on the part of the community about exposure to mill-related contamination. So the purpose of our collaboration was to identify and affirm what kind of technological strategies we're going to use to achieve compliance, and to recommend actionable, consensus-driven actions to reduce risk. We met with our tribal groups for a period of 8 weeks to exchange ideas and to deliver what we view as potential engineering measures to modify our current groundwater compliance action strategy. And we participated with our stakeholder groups in conjunction with our national laboratory network, where we were getting technical recommendations as to what we might be able to do from an engineering standpoint, but also working with tribal government entities to make sure they understood what those alternatives were. And so they'd know that we're physically, and moving forward in our cleanup strategy and evaluating groundwater remediation options, and looking for ways to reduce risk from a technical standpoint and human health standpoint. So we engaged with our stakeholder community and made sure that we have honest and frank discussions with them concerning institutional controls and what our end state vision looked like for sites. And so one of the things that we've recognized is that Shiprock, for example, the disposal cell in Tuba City, disposal cells are going to be a continuing source of groundwater contamination. So what can we do to reduce that contaminant footprint? And so we have engineering knowledge that we can apply toward this. And the tribal community has really been adamant in us recognizing that they don't think about things strictly from an engineering standpoint or a science kind of standpoint. They are valuing what they would call traditional ecological knowledge. So it means that we can't approach, say, risk assessments from the standpoint that we would normally have done in areas off the reservation, where we look at water use exclusively. Like I was mentioning earlier, the Native people are tied to the land. They use vegetation in different ways that we probably aren't accustomed to in the Anglo community. And there's medicinal and cultural and spiritual uses of vegetation. So what if that vegetation is being collected in places where there's contaminated groundwater? We want to make sure that that risk is non-existent for those kinds of uses as well. So we have to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge in our assessments and make sure that the tribal community understands that we as DOE are listening to their concerns so that we can maintain trust, that trust relationship. And then we define what our short-term goals are versus our long-term goals for the site. And so strategies for risk reduction include making sure that our institutional controls are in a place where it makes sense. We're not overly restrictive. And on the other hand, we're not less restrictive than we should be. So we're evaluating those kinds of questions. Supporting internships and STEM workshops in both Shiprock and Tuba City. Those are all important ways for us to educate and make sure that the upcoming youngsters who are growing into adulthood have a basis for understanding the decisions that are being made, because a lot of these decisions are going to play out over the next few decades. The impact of those decisions will play out over the next few decades. So it's good to have informed stakeholders in in the educational community as well, so that they evolve and work into being responsible adults and participating in our decision-making process and have a basis, a technical basis for understanding what those choices are. And so it's a similar strategy for Tuba City. We've worked with the Tuba City community in STEM workshops. And we're making sure that we involve the stakeholders in the groundwater remedy, development of strategies for that, and make sure that we've made sure that we've communicated what our alternatives are for institutional controls. In some cases, like with the Hopi community and the Navajo community as well, we've looked at evaluating alternative sources of water. It's important that, especially in the case of the Hopi community, that they're limited in terms of their economic diversity by having readily available sources of water to sustain their population. So in areas of water scarcity, we're trying to be sensitive to the fact that we can't just be evaporating, pumping and evaporating contaminated groundwater. It doesn't make any sense. So we need to be sensitive to that. So we're embodying that kind of decision-making process in our strategies for those sites. So some final thoughts might leave you with, just make sure that I emphasize it's really important that we have technical strategies for groundwater compliance, but that those strategies, that we vet those with our stakeholder community, and make sure that we engage closely with our community and consider the value that tribal government relationship brings to our overall program, and make sure that we value and nurture those relationships in a way that makes those participations with the tribal community more meaningful, both to them and to LM. And that concludes the talk. Thank you very much. Hopefully there's a way for us to have question and answer. There's a beautiful parting shot there of the Shiprock volcanic neck there, and I'll leave you with that. Thanks very much.